Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Index 2026 online conversation series. I am very pleased to welcome in our first event Antony Loewenstein. Hi, Antony. Thank you very much for being present with us and for having accepted our invitation.
Pleasure. It's great to be here.
So today, this year's theme of the Index Festival is around power. And so Index usually brings together art, media and critical thinking around urgent issues. And this year it aims to explore how exponential technological advances are reshaping power structures, contributing to social and political fragmentation, inequality and pervasive surveillance. So today's conversation looks at one of the most complex and contested intersections of power in our time: surveillance, warfare, technology and global influence, departing from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and progressively, eventually extending globally. So, Antony, you are an independent journalist, filmmaker and author whose work focuses on power, occupation, global politics. And we are here also to talk with you about your latest book, departing from that, the Palestine Laboratory, where you investigate how systems of control and military technology developed by Israel's military-industrial complex have been tested in Palestine territory and then exported worldwide, often marketed also as battle-tested. So, and you also host the Palestine Laboratory podcast, which I recommend to everyone that is here listening to us. Thank you so much for being here. Just to inform everyone listening to us, we are recording this on March 20. So this interview will go online around mid-May. We probably will not be focusing on events that can take place after today, but we imagine that a lot of things can happen from now until then. I wanted to start by contextualizing a little bit so that our listeners understand a little bit where you come from, what is your path as someone from the Jewish diaspora that is based in Sydney, grew up in Australia. So in your book, you mentioned that you acknowledge that you grew up within a liberal Zionist environment. So how did you grow up? What was the image about Israel that you believed in, and then how everything changed, how you began working and reporting from the West Bank and Palestine? So maybe you can share a little bit about that initial context.
Thank you for that question. It's great to be here and have this conversation, which is always timely. I grew up in Melbourne, Australia, which is the second biggest city here in Australia. I live in Sydney now, but I grew up in Melbourne. I grew up from the mid-1970s, essentially, and my family lived in Australia mostly, but most of my extended family had been killed in the Holocaust, which is a fairly, sadly, typical Jewish story. They were mostly based in Europe in the early half of the 20th century, and unfortunately, the vast majority couldn't get out. When it was too late, they couldn't find an exit route, and they were killed by the Nazis. The ones who did get out, my grandparents and others in 1939, were spread around the world, so Australia, US, UK, Europe. And when I was growing up, Israel wasn't the centre of our lives, but certainly I was told by my parents, even my grandparents, that Israel was seen as a possible safe haven. For those who aren't aware, as a Jew, if you can prove that you're Jewish, normally it goes through the mother, can you somehow show that you have Jewish heritage, you can go to Israel. To this day, prove that, and within a matter of months you're going to be an Israeli citizen. Now, I am not an Israeli citizen, just to be clear, but certainly that is possible. And one of the reasons I've always opposed that is that Palestinians don't have that same right. I mean, Palestinians have as much right to the land, if frankly far more, and they don't have that right. And so it's always deeply discriminatory. So when I was growing up, again, Israel wasn't the centre of our lives, but it was there, it was present, it was something that I was told to support. And I remember when I was growing up as a teenager, and of course it's worth saying for people who are younger, this was before the internet, so our knowledge about things, frankly, were different. I mean, I'm not saying there was complete ignorance, there was the world before the internet, but it is a very different world, it just is, the information that we get access to. So the information that we would hear about was mostly through the so-called mainstream media, Australian media, probably US media, obviously media in English. But there was always something that struck me as kind of off about the fact that I have no recollection of meeting a Palestinian, zero. And that's not a crime, except the fact that we had been told that Palestinians were a threat. They were violent, they were essentially the new Nazis. I often remember hearing that term. Yasser Arafat, who was then the leader of the Palestinians, we were told was akin to Hitler. I mean, I hear these comments now and they just sound absurd. That was from my family, from the synagogue, from rabbis, from the Jewish community. There was fear, there was clearly generational trauma. Melbourne has one of the highest percentages of Holocaust survivors in the world. And that very much, I think, informs, outside of Israel, per capita, so that very much, I think, has informed the generally quite conservative view towards the Middle East, towards Israel, antagonism or hatred towards Arabs. So I guess as I grew up, for a variety of reasons, that struck me as off, as wrong. And I didn't really have the language or the understanding to fully explain that when I was 15 or something. But I guess as time went on, I started reading more, I started becoming more aware, I started challenging the myths that I'd been brought up on around Israel being a safe haven for Jews. And this is what I was always told, Israel is a safe haven. In fact, I still get told this now. I mean, people don't say this to me so much now because they know I'm not going to agree. But it always struck me as a very strange concept because a safe haven, what does that mean? I mean, essentially, just to give people a bit of a sense, there's about 16 million Jews in the world, roughly. It's a very small population, roughly half in Israel and half in the US, and obviously then around the world, Europe, Australia, etc. It's a very small population, obviously, because the Holocaust killed 6 million of us. And this idea somehow that being in Israel would make us safer, when actually, and I'll finish on this point, I didn't have the language to understand this at the time, but I certainly feel this now. It's arguably more unsafe to be a Jew in Israel than anywhere else on the planet. I'm not denying anti-Semitism in the West, in Portugal and Australia. It's real, it exists, it's maybe growing in certain places. I'm not denying that. But how can anyone credibly say that it's safe to be a Jew in Israel? Because of countless wars, because of Israeli government policy, because of occupation, all these reasons. So I grew up with a lot of myths, as many Jews, if you speak to them, will say the same thing.
Yeah, it makes sense. And all this idea that was perpetuated on the Israel being a safe haven for Jews, this has also to do with and the neglect about Palestinian lives and Palestinian conditions is also much to do with Israeli censorship and also the self-censorship in Western media. For sure.
Totally.
This also contributed to your awareness, to our awareness of what was going on the field.
And the ignorance, for that matter. And the ignorance.
Absolutely.
I mean, there was profound... I mean, again, of course, you know, Palestinian friends of mine will always say, well, if you spoke to us, we'd have told you. We knew what was going on. It wasn't a secret for us.
Not enough Palestinian voices voiced through media.
The mainstream media,
Mainstream media. Not enough now, but more and more, and we hope that
for sure.
there will be
and social media now, of course, which I guess we might talk about. Social media has changed the game in many ways.
Absolutely. And so I think that maybe it could help to go a little bit back in time and understand. So this idea of safety, of Israel being a safe haven, had to be predicated on the idea of a militarized state. a highly militarized state, because if you look around geopolitically where Israel was grounded, even before 1948, in your book you explain, and also in the podcast, how these early Zionist ideologies were also predicated on the need of this idea of security, and how early militias, and when Palestine was still under British colonial rule, how these two forces contributed to build up this very early idea in the beginning of the 20th century of the need of Israel being constituted with this highly militarized, as an highly militarized state. So maybe just if you would like to just go a little bit back on history on that, and and to make a bridge of how then Israel is this startup nation, where economically is also very much based on this technology and military industry complex, which it then exports around the world.
Something I do talk about in the Palestine Laboratory, but something I'm working on for another book project, which I won't go into, but goes into a bit more detail about the origins of, not so much origins of Zionism, but for those maybe who are not aware, the birth of Zionism was mostly in Europe. It was in the 1900s, the late 1900s. It was based on some Jewish people who had undeniable legitimate concerns about their safety in Europe. That wasn't a fiction. They weren't making that up. There was genuine anti-Semitism in lots of parts of Europe. Their solution to that, though, of course, was the real problem, which was we're going to leave Europe and set up a country somewhere else. It wasn't necessarily going to be Palestine. Of course, it ended up being so, and dispossessing the people who lived there, which were a majority Arab. I mean, this was the original sin, and we're still dealing with the ramifications of that 80 years on. But yes, you're right. The British took control of Palestine pretty much after World War I. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. The British Empire rose. I mean, the British Empire, of course, had been around for a long time. It was at one point the most powerful nation on the planet, sort of similar to the US today. The US's power, I would argue, is declining, but still, I think, would be the most powerful nation on the planet, even with Donald Trump as president. And the British, in fact, often worked with the Zionists to arm them. There were militias. There were various ways to terrorize Arabs who were living in very towns and villages and cities in what was then Palestine. And there was, I don't want to say there was a degree of inevitability about Israel becoming a state. I mean, the question that's regularly asked, would Israel have been founded if there was not the Holocaust? It's one of those what-if historical questions. I don't know the answer to that. My guess is it would not have happened when it did. Whether it would have happened decades after, we'll never know. But there was clearly a lot of momentum and, I think to some extent, guilt and other emotions going on in many Western countries. Also, frankly, racism towards Arabs. There are many factors going on to contribute to the establishment of Israel in 1948. And as you say, from the beginning, it was a highly militarized state. Why? Because most Arab countries and citizens didn't support it because they'd been essentially ethnically cleansed, right? I mean, Israel ethnically cleansed roughly 750,000 Arabs from what was Palestine. Some of them are still dealing, well, we are dealing with the ramifications of that now. And from the beginning, as I talk about in my book, The Palestine Laboratory, there was elements of military training. There were certain weapons that were being tested. There were certain weapons that were being made. Back then it was fairly basic weapons, of course, guns and other kind of things. There were certain tactics to try to suppress or contain Arab revolt. People often forget about this, and it often makes me sort of laugh in a grim way that, you know, from 1948 to 1967, so before the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza began,
So
for much of the
first
international...
Nakba.
From the Nakba in 1948 to 1967, 20-odd years. For much of the global left, Israel was a massively positive thing. People often forget this today. It was heralded as this socialist paradise. Now, it seems utterly ridiculous to talk about that now because for those first 20 years, Arabs were under military rule. It wasn't like there was democracy for Arabs. There was a degree of socialism for Jews, to be sure. I'm not denying that. But this idea somehow that, as you see you read what was said at the time, you see footage at the time, you see ads that were being promoted in the US to try to bring tourism, the propaganda being put out by Jewish organizations and others that somehow Israel was this socialist paradise in the heart of the Middle East, which is always sunny and everything's beautiful and the girls are in bikinis, you know, all that kind of rhetoric. And it was complete bullshit, frankly. It was utter nonsense. I'm not denying the fact that it's often not sunny and there's lots of, good weather, fine. But this idea somehow that it was a socialist paradise for Jews. And this is the issue at hand. It's a socialist paradise for Jews, right?
It was neglecting everything that came with it, like the dispossessment of Palestinian and all the Arabs that own the right of the land.
Totally. And I mean, and the impact of this briefly, let me just bring it to the more present day very quickly, is that what many Israeli leaders early on realized was that to survive as a state, they needed to make friends. And that's not unique. Any new state wants to make friends. That's not a crime on its own. But the problem had been how they did that. And from the 1950s, but certainly accelerates after 1967, Israel takes control of the West Bank and Gaza. All of a sudden, they have all these more Palestinians that they kind of have to occupy or control. And they started essentially testing new weapons, new techniques of control. Many other countries found that very attractive. They were interested in trying to copy that. Israel was selling that technology and those techniques all over the world. Democracies in dictatorships. And that pretty much is where we're still at now, right? We're nearly 60 years after the occupation began of West Bank and Gaza. And things have changed. There's more Palestinians. There's more sophisticated weapons, of course. But the underlying ideology has not changed one bit.
It's curious, though, to how Israel was pictured as a socialist state, but then he was exporting arms to regimes like Pinochet and other authoritarian regimes, and later in Rwanda and so on and so on. So he was at the same time negotiating and exporting arms and growing its economy also upon that. And recently, we a series of organizations have declared that Israel was and is an apartheid state, and later on even that it's committing war crimes and with evidence of genocide, and we all know this. But I just would like to bring this relation that you also mentioned in the book, which is very interesting, about the relation also with South Africa, Israel and South Africa, the alliances, how Israel also contributed to fuel the apartheid regime, the sharing techniques, surveillance and control methods beyond weaponry, and also how we see now today that South Africa also responds against and is very politically active in this.
One of the things I talk about in the book is you say, go on, you wanted to say something?
No, this is maybe this is just another example of these alliances that we were talking.
If people are interested in more, apart from what I write in the book, I also did a film version of the Palestine Laboratory, which came out last year with Al Jazeera, a 2-part series where essentially it's a global investigation. And we went to South Africa as one of the countries we visited. I went there about a year and a half ago to look at what that relationship meant. Let me briefly explain to people. So apartheid ended in 1994. It started in 1948, the same year that Israel was born. It was obviously a system based on racial supremacy. Blacks were treated as second-class citizens. Whites were treated as superior. Whites were a minority, though, but blacks were a majority. They were often pushed into incredibly poor housing. They were slave labor in many cases. They were tremendous amount of violence to maintain that. Essentially, it was legal segregation. And one of the things I try to explain in the book and the film, and I guess on the podcast, around that question was the Israel-South African apartheid relationship was not just, as you said, about weapons. Israel has a relationship with many countries where it is just that. country X or Y wants a missile defense shield, spyware, whatever. But the relationship between Israel and apartheid South Africa was also ideological. They shared a similar worldview. What was that worldview? Well, Israel supported South Africa's racial supremacy. They were frankly often incredibly racist. They saw whites as superior, and South Africa equally, and this is based on not my opinion, it's based on documents that we have, that we see letters that were exchanged between the countries and the military in that period, mostly in the 60s, 70s and 80s. Many South African leaders supported the apartheid in Palestine. They saw it an appropriate racial segregation, which is what's happening in Palestine largely is, on Jewish supremacy, essentially. And the idea that you would have all these documents which have now been released, a lot of this has not been released yet. In other words, there's still, which is sort of bizarre in a way, because, you know, when you go there, I mean, South Africa, as you say, has had a black government since 1994. I mean, the ANC is a very complicated, often very corrupt government and organisation. But they still are withholding huge amounts of documents about the relationship between Israel and apartheid South Africa. You have to ask yourself, why is that? This is not their government, it's a former government. Now, I mean, one can only presume the reason. I don't know exactly. Protecting government secrets, who knows? I'm not really sure. But as you say, I very much see the move that the South African government has taken in the last few years since October 7 and Israel's genocide in Gaza, taking Israel to the International Court of Justice and being a key advocate of that. I very much see as tied to the history that many South African blacks have, knowing what Israel supported in their country decades ago. I'm talking about so-called revenge. I don't think necessarily it's that. Maybe some see it that way. But as an idea of holding Israel to account. Now, this case, the ICJ, has nothing to do with apartheid South Africa. It's about Gaza, of course. But there is something about, I don't know, I see it as an attempt at historical justice.
Accountability.
Accountability. And
So let's bring another topic, which is the 9/11 and the so-called war on terror, and how that was also a tipping point and a trigger. How do you think that Israel also contributed to reshape the demands or to reshape this war on terror, how this alliance between the US and Israel, and how it increased all the complex of control and surveillance until now?
I mean, in some ways, it's a strange thing, right? Because 9/11, of course, had nothing to do with Israel, at least not directly. It was an attack on America, Washington, New York. There were, 3,000 odd Americans who were killed. Certainly a motivation of bin Laden was partly the Western and US backing for Israel, but the attack did not happen in Israel, it happened in the US. And on the day or day after, I forget, within a day or so of the attack, Netanyahu, who was then not Prime Minister, he's been in politics, he's obviously speaks English fluently, he spent a lot of time in the US, he's in the media in the US a lot, is basically asked what he thought about the attack. And what he said was, and I'm paraphrasing, I haven't got the words in front of me, something like, "Oh, it's very good." And the journalist was a bit taken aback. Now, I don't think he was necessarily saying he thinks it's good that 3,000 people were killed. I mean, who knows with Netanyahu? But what he meant was, and he did explain it, that America now will understand what we're going through. We've been going through for decades, Israel. And what Israel did very quickly, and its so-called homeland security industries, was selling a message to the world saying, we, Israel, have been fighting terrorism forever. If you want to help on that, if you want to fight terrorism like we are, come to us. We can sell you technology and tactics and techniques. And a lot of the world did. They still do.
They still do, of course. Yeah.
So 9/11 in many ways was an absolute huge benefit for Israel economically, politically, and financially, as ironically October 7 has been too, in a way, which is a bit more complicated, but which I guess maybe we'll get to. But 9/11 certainly was, and you have all these examples. As one example comes to mind, a lot of the American officials who work on the border between the US and Mexico, or police forces within the US would increasingly send their forces to Israel for training, or vice versa. This idea somehow that Israel was an expert at dealing with infiltration, or, I mean, the irony is, of course, I'm not saying that American police need Israel to be racist or be discriminatory. They have their own long history of doing that, which has nothing to do with Israel. But it is interesting how, and this continues, by the way, to this day, it has not stopped. A lot of American police forces go to Israel for training, get advice, and vice versa. And I think that makes sense in a way, because there is a general, again, ideological alignment there. How many American police and Border Patrol view, in America's case, Hispanics, Latinos, brown or black people, and how Israel sees Palestinians. Very, very similar. I mean, to the point now, just briefly to finish on this point, is that since Trump came back into power, all of us have seen these horrible images of ICE, these ICE raids across America, people being killed, including American citizens. Some of the technology that ICE is using is Israeli. Not all of it, but some of it. And that makes sense in a way, right? Because it's seen as battle-tested. It's battle-tested in Palestine, and it's being now brought home. And inevitably, as I often say, what happens in Palestine never stays there. It inevitably comes home, whether it's Portugal, Australia, America, wherever.
So do you think that the privatization of occupation has also contributed to this increase in strategies and in also control tools?
I do.
And how does that also changes the nation of occupation and difficult accountability?
I don't think I mentioned this phrase in my book, The Palestine Laboratory, but I've done lots of work in the last years on disaster capitalism. I did a book about it and a film. And that book and film wasn't about Israel-Palestine, it was about Haiti and Afghanistan and other places. But the ideology fits, that disaster capitalism was continuing the work that Naomi Klein did on her book, The Shock Doctrine, which came out about 20 years ago now, 2007. And essentially it's people who make money from misery. That's the shortest way to see it. War, technology, immigration, whatever it may be. And
find your enemy. Find your enemy.
Find your enemy and make money from it.
And make money from it, yeah. And control it and make money from it, yeah.
Yeah, so look, the occupation in Palestine, West Bank and Gaza is not solely privatized, as I talk about in the book. It is partially privatized. Some of it's run by the state, some of it's funded by the state. There is increasing, for example, number of private security employed by settlers in settlements to what they call repel Palestinians, but essentially it's often to injure or kill them. Often the soldiers standing at checkpoints throughout the West Bank that Palestinians have to go through are privatized. As I say in the book, in a way, for a Palestinian, it doesn't really make any difference whether it's a privatized security guard who's a thug or an IDF soldier. Who cares? Ultimately, they're going to dehumanize you as a Palestinian. It makes no difference. And there's no accountability for any of them. But there's no doubt that there is a growing sense that, I mean, it's ironic in a way. The occupation, on the one hand, costs huge amounts of money every year for Israel to maintain. You have 5 million Palestinians under occupation, 3 million in the West Bank, around 2 million in Gaza. They've been like that for nearly 60 years, since 1967. And ultimately, it is bleeding Israel financially, but it is seen as beneficial also financially and ideologically to continue it. And I think years ago, I maybe thought that the occupation wasn't sustainable. And now I'm not so sure. I mean, I think, one can never speak about forever in the world. I mean, forever means a very long time. But for the foreseeable future, there's no reason why it's not sustainable. I mean, much of the West supports it. When I say the West, much of Europe does. The US certainly does. There's no real serious pressure against Israel to stop the occupation. There's lots of very concerned statements by, the EU and Brussels. These days, the Trump administration is pretty much all in with Israel.
Yeah.
As we're recording this now, there is a war in Iran that may well have changed by the time this event is published. But I mean, ultimately, Israel is now at war with much of the region.
Mm-hmm.
Iran, Syria, Lebanon.
Yeah.
And no one, and who is going to stop that? I mean, this is the ultimate problem. There is no serious power to stop them. Yeah. Zero, so or no one willing to do so.
Let's maybe go to the event, to the October 7, and understand how after October 7, Palestine was the laboratory intensified, and I don't know if you also would like to bring issues about AI controlled weaponry, about error, about all this kind of.
Yeah.
Let's talk about a little bit about October 7, and then we can just go to our current context and also try to.
Yeah. I mean, October 7 should have been an example of how the laboratory doesn't work. Now, what I mean by that is that all the technology that Israel had around Gaza, the walls, the sensors, the surveillance, it all failed.
Should have prevented October 7. Yeah.
Well, in theory, I mean, that's what the Israeli military thought would happen. That essentially Israel was a fortress. Hamas was content running Gaza. They, as people may be aware, Israel was literally facilitating money to go into Gaza to fund Hamas from Qatar. That was Netanyahu. So Israel had deluded itself both through technological delusion and ideological delusion that they were protected, that they had walls and sensors and drones, and who was going to, Hamas, this sort of stupid guerrilla force in Gaza, wasn't going to come and attack Israel and kidnap people and kill people. Now, that obviously was shown to be a folly, but I don't think October 7 was simply a technological failure. It was an ideological and an imagination failure. It was this belief, and I've been to Israel and spoken to lots of Israeli generals and others who clearly don't see the world the way I do. They're fundamentally opposite. But many of them said to me, and a lot of this is in the Palestine Laboratory film, that there was a belief amongst the vast majority of political and military figures in Israel that they couldn't conceptualize or imagine something like October 7 happen. It is true that there have been various reports and intelligence from Israeli intelligence imagining something like that happening. That's now been released in the last few years. We know that. Something remarkably similar to what ended up happening on that day. But there was this deluded belief that, Palestinians will just be content with being occupied forever. What does that tell you about a mindset? Delusional, racist, colonial. So October 7 happens. Obviously, from Israel's perspective, it was a complete catastrophe. There were roughly 1,200 people killed, some soldiers, some civilians, 250 kidnapped into Gaza. We all know what happens after. But as you rightly say, it was very quick that many of the Israeli defense companies who had failed miserably on October 7, their technology did not work, or Hamas was able to shut it down or destroy it, they pivoted very quickly. And as soon as Israel sent ground troops into Gaza, which happened in late October 2003, there was obviously airstrikes from the day itself, but Israel didn't send troops into Gaza until the end of October that year, so about 3 or so weeks afterwards. Israel was very quickly, its mission, which wasn't even particularly hidden, was mass destruction. I mean, they said it. This was not pinpoint targeting, going after so-called terrorists. The aim was mass destruction. And this ties into your second part of your question about AI, artificial intelligence.
Do you think they saw it as an opportunity also?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yes, I do. They saw it as a chance to... Now, was the would they have imagined on October 30, 2023, that all of Gaza now would basically be leveled? I don't know, but they certainly imagined mass destruction, a chance to do in Gaza what they'd never had the chance to do before, to make Gaza unlivable, which is basically what Gaza is now. There are obviously roughly 2 million Palestinians still living there, but we've all seen the reality of what's happening there. It's basically unlivable. I mean, you can live there, but it's close to unlivable, right? So Israel had used artificial intelligence before. They'd used it in their Gaza war in 2021, but it was a huge acceleration of that. They're using tools like people may have heard of Where's Daddy, Lavender, essentially using massive amounts of data which they've been collecting for a long time, putting it into an AI system which then spits out so-called targets. And there was barely any human oversight into that. So they start throwing out this school, this hospital, this house, this building, this apartment block. And we saw the result of that within the Israeli military, they had lawyers who would justify mass destruction. They would say, okay, the system says there's a low-level Hamas militant in building X. You may well kill 200, 300, 400 civilians at the same time. You're allowed to do that. I mean, it's completely insane, illegal, completely. And the impact was not, as we're often sold AI as, which is it's pinpoint targeting, going after the bad guys. In the first few months, the aim was carnage. That's exactly what they wanted. They wanted revenge. And I've spoken to people there who would say, we felt the Israeli government and military, after October 7, felt like they had been completely caught off guard, which they basically had been. And the way they wanted to address that was revenge, was destroying Gaza, and as we know, the vast bulk of the world supported that. Virtually every Western country, with some exceptions. The US did, of course. The biggest provider of weapons to Israel was America, of course. Germany was number 2. The EU was basically on board. Obviously, over time, countries like Spain became far more critical, but in general, much of the EU supported it, and frankly still does support Israel. Like, nothing has changed, right? I think what has changed is public opinion is radically changing in many countries to being very much against Israel, including in the US. But Israel had complete carte blanche to do what they wanted to do, as they do, for example, now in Lebanon or Iran. And America is using similar AI tools in Iran. We now know that they are using a combination of Claude, which is an Anthropic's AI tool. They're using Palantir. And what Israel did, and also the US is doing, is harnessing massive amounts of cloud space provided by the Amazons, Googles, and Microsoft. So Israel could not have fought its war in Gaza without all these Silicon Valley tech companies providing all this massive cloud
alliances.
Service. Exactly. So in some ways, those companies were also testing the technology in Gaza, because for them, it wasn't just financial. Israel's a small country. The contracts weren't that big. I mean, Google's a multi-billion-dollar company. It's showing what is possible to then maybe sell that to others. So which is why I keep on saying to people, if you think what happens in Gaza or Iran won't happen elsewhere, you're delusional. It will, and it already is. What we're seeing in Iran. The aim in Iran from the US is actually mass destruction, certainly from the Israeli perspective. It's mass destruction. It's causing chaos within Iran. That is the point. Not to bring down the regime. That would be a side effect. It's basically to bring chaos within Iran, to make Iran less of a so-called regional threat. That's the Israeli goal.
And we're not, of course, we can talk about the current situation in terms of war in Iran, spreading to Lebanon and so on, but also this all these surveillance and control techniques will also be exported to democratic countries. They are already exported and being put into practice. Checking our phones, checking our under the excuse of security and
totally. And I think there is a mistake if people believe that this is just appearing in dictatorships or police states. It's not true, as you say, where you are in Europe. virtually not every European country, but many, including in Western Europe, in the last 5 years, there's been scandal after scandal after scandal of Israeli spyware being used by government, intelligence services, police services against dissidents, critics, human rights activists. This is now normal, so-called normal, because there's no regulation. Again, it's a laboratory being exported to the West. So it's not just happening in dictatorships, Saudi Arabia, UAE. It's happening there too, but it's also happening in our countries as well. And I think a lot of people who are aware of that feel pretty helpless.
Yes, I think that's overall a feeling across many people that I know too. It's this sense of helplessness, and how to be able to contribute to any kind of change, how to. So this brings me to a question. Maybe it's a very difficult question, but I remember reading in the beginning of your book that if you once thought about the possibility of a two-state solution, then what you really would cherish for would be a one state where people could freely live together.
Yes.
So, how do you think that? Considering our current situation now, the escalation of conflict with Iran and all the Middle East countries around, and Lebanon, do you think that Lebanon will also be a laboratory? It is being possibly already also a testing laboratory.
Yeah, if you asked me 20 years ago, I was saying I supported a two-state solution, which was fairly standard view. These days, and I've thought this now for over a decade, I had a book, an edited collection people can find called After Zionism, which was edited with a Palestinian born in Gaza, but he lives in the US, and a series of essays by Palestinians and Jews and others articulating what a one-state solution would look like, essentially. I'm not someone who thinks this is going to be utopian, that somehow you click your fingers and tomorrow everyone's going to get along and hug each other. I'm under no illusion about the reality there. And I'm under no illusion about the challenges in a place like South Africa. South Africa ended apartheid, to be sure, and that's obviously an undeniably good thing. But South Africa is a very broken country today. There's no question about that. Economically, it's one of the most unequal in the world, and apartheid, in fact, still exists there. It's economic apartheid now, rather than racial apartheid. So I'm under no illusion about the challenges. I think the only way, it's a step-by-step process. The beginning, to me, is without massive global economic pressure and pain on Israel, this situation will never change. In other words, South Africa, white South Africans, the majority, didn't suddenly wake up one morning in 1989 and say, God, this apartheid thing is terrible. There were some whites who opposed it, but the majority, life was good. Why would they end it? They didn't have a problem with the racism. They were benefiting economically. When the world started saying to them, as it did, you have a choice. You either change and essentially end apartheid, or you become even more of a pariah than you are now. I'm talking about late 1980s, when much of the world finally turned against them, including the US. Although it's interesting, as I say in the book, the country that stuck with South African apartheid to the end was Israel. To the end, right? So, yes, to me, a one-state solution is inevitable and necessary, but we are obviously so far away from them. I mean, there's a one state now. It's just an unequal apartheid state. I mean, there is a one state. It's not the state that people want. And I think, ultimately, people don't give up privilege without pain. So Israeli Jews, and based on polling, particularly in the last 2 years since October 7, are an increasingly genocidal state. What I mean by that is, putting aside what's been going on in Gaza and beyond, the views that a majority of Israelis these days have, a support of starvation of Palestinians in Gaza, ethnically cleansing Palestinians. Again, this is not an opinion, this is what Israeli polling is saying.
Yeah.
We are in a very, very dark place. And I think much of the Western press isn't really aware of that extremism that is so mainstream in Israel. This is not just... The Western media is obsessed with the Ben Gavirs and the Smotrich. They are extremists. They're Israeli government ministers. They're terrible. It's not a defense of them. And the problem in Israel is not Netanyahu. I've said this for years. Netanyahu is a odious, horrible man who should be in The Hague. It's not a defence of him at all. But the problem in Israel is not Netanyahu. It's far, far deeper than that. It's not just a one-man problem. Netanyahu will eventually fall as Prime Minister this year, next year, who knows when. The likely replacements are no different because that reflects public opinion.
There's a structural, deep problem.
So, yes, I support one state is the short answer. I obviously regularly despair about where this is all going and where we're at. But I still feel
we all despair.
We all despair that inevitably that needs to happen. But clearly, particularly after the last 2 years, the idea of Jews and Palestinians kind of living happily ever after, we are obviously very, very far away from that.
I absolutely agree, yeah. So I was just wondering if about the current conflict against Iran, do you would like to add something? We don't know what will happen when this will be online, but...
No. Well, look, yeah, I can say a few things. I mean, look, the US and Israeli attack on Iran at the time of recording is cataclysmic. And it's cataclysmic because it was based on a delusion. I think particularly from the American perspective, the Israeli perspective is a little bit different, but Trump, I think, had been sold. And this is not by any means to excuse Trump. He's a US president. He makes a decision. I mean, he's ultimately responsible. But my understanding, speaking to various people, sources, is Trump was sold a lie. And what I mean by that is he was sold this idea that it would be like Venezuela. We're going to go into Iran. We're going to kill everybody. Iran's going to come begging to the table and say, please stop, sir. And they negotiate something. And that obviously hasn't happened. Now, again, by May, who knows where this is at. The regime may have fallen in Tehran, although I seriously doubt it. The regime at this point is relatively strong. Weakened, yes, but strong. It's a deeply brutal, ugly, horrible regime. It's no defense of the Iranian regime at all. But this is nothing to do, this deluded military campaign is not about freedom for Iranians, or it's not about that. As I said, it's about killing any control and killing any regional rival to Israel. And ultimately, I'll just finish on this point, is that Israel, and sadly far too many Jews around the world, although that is changing, live under this, it's a lie, that military power is going to bring Israel or Jews safety and security, when actually the opposite is true. Israeli actions are directly making us less safe and directly leading to more anti-Semitism. Anti-Semites are anti-Semitic for their own reasons, whatever the deluded reasons are. They hate Jews for whatever the reasons are. It's not justifying thugs being thugs. But it's pretty hard to ignore the fact that Israeli actions, what people are seeing day in and day out in Gaza, the West Bank, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, wherever it may be, this wholesale destruction of people's lives, blowing limbs off, all this horribleness, how would that not impact people's views about Israel or Jews? And none of that is making Israel safer. I mean, again, that doesn't overly concern me, but Israel believes in a delusional way that it's getting safer. Actually, the opposite is true. And certainly for global Jews, Israeli actions are making life for all of us more unsafe, not safer. So there is as I often say, there is a desperate need for a moral reckoning within the Jewish community in the diaspora. I mean, Israel for sure, but I'm talking about in the global diaspora. For the fact that for so long, 80 odd years, a sizable proportion of the global Jewish community have sided and supported and funded and backed Israel. It's been a catastrophic moral, political disaster, principally, of course, for Palestinians, obviously. But to think that 80 odd years after the Holocaust, the legacy now of Jews is a genocide in Gaza.
A genocide.
It's mind-boggling and shameful, and sadly, much of the Jewish establishment in many countries, I can't speak for Portugal, but I guess it's pretty similar, is very unwilling to have that moral conversation. And this is where we're at. There are growing numbers of Jews who oppose what's going on, but in terms of the so-called mainstream, they're all in with Israel. All in. And it's a disaster.
Absolutely. It's also very complex when we see that Israel's economy also is so funded and dependent also on war. So
Totally.
let's see how it will be when this will be online in May, mid-May. Hopefully better, we hope.
Hopefully, inshallah.
Somehow better. Anthony, it was such a pleasure and such an honor to have you here, and thank you so much for all your work, and we look forward to continue reading you and listening you. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. It's been wonderful. Thanks so much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.